first of our 1980 presidential debates. The League is a nonpartisan organization. We're presenting these debates to provide citizens an opportunity to see and hear the candidates state their positions on important issues of concern to us all. Our moderator is Bill Moyers.
Thank you, Mrs. Hannafeld. My colleagues and I agreed to participate tonight, although the questioners are limited by the constraints of the format, because we thought with the League of Women Voters that it is desirable to seek a comparison of views on a few issues in a joint appearance by the men who would be the next President of the United States. Former Governor Ronald Reagan, the Republican Party candidate, and Congressman John Anderson, who is running as an independent, accepted the League of Women Voters' invitation to be here. President Carter declined. Mr. Reagan and Mr. Anderson will respond with their views on certain issues posed by questions from my colleagues. Carol Loomis of Fortune magazine, Daniel Greenberg, a syndicated columnist, Charles Cordry of the Baltimore Sun, Lee May of the Los Angeles Times, Jane Bryant Quinn of Newsweek, and Soma Golden of the New York Times. None of the questions has been submitted in advance to either the League of Women Voters or to the candidates or to their representatives. Gentlemen, thank you both for coming. The ground rules you agreed upon with the League are brief. Each panelist will ask a single question. You will have 2.5 minutes in which to respond. After you've stated your positions in those 2.5 minutes, each of you will have 1 minute and 15 seconds for response. At the close of the debate, each of you will have 3 minutes for closing remarks. We ask the Convention Center audience to abide by one simple ground rule. Please do not applaud or express approval or disapproval during the debate. You may do that on November 4th. Having won the toss of the coin, Mr. Anderson will respond to the first question from Carol Loomis.
Mr. Anderson, opinion polls show that the American public sees inflation as the country's #1 economic problem. Yet as individuals, they oppose cures that hurt them personally. Elected officials have played along by promising to cure inflation while backing away from tough programs that might hurt one special interest group or another, and by actually adding inflationary elements to the system, such as indexing. They have gone for what is politically popular rather than for what might work and amount to leadership. My question, and please be specific, is what politically unpopular measures are you willing to endorse, push, and stay with that might provide real progress in reducing inflation?
Well, Ms. Loomis, I think it's very appropriate that the first question in this first debate of Campaign 80 should relate to the economy of the country. Because it seems to me that the people who are watching us tonight, 221 million Americans, are truly concerned about the poor rate of performance of the American economy over the last 4 years. Now, Governor Reagan is not responsible for what has happened over the last 4 years, nor am I. The man who should be here tonight to respond to those charges chose not to attend. But I want to answer as specifically as I can the question that you have just put to me. And let me tell you that I, first of all, oppose an election year tax cut. Whether it is the 10% across-the-board tax cut promised to the taxpayers by my opponent in this debate tonight, or whether it is the $27.5 billion tax cut promised on the 20th of August by President Carter. I simply think that when we are confronting a budget deficit this year, and this fiscal year will end in about 10 days, and we are confronted with the possibility of a deficit of $60 billion, perhaps as much as $63 billion, that simply would be irresponsible. That once again the printing presses will start to roll. Once again we will see the monetization of that debt result in a higher rate of inflation. Even though we've seen some hopeful signs perhaps in the flash report on the third quarter that perhaps the economy is coming out of the recession, we've also seen the rise in the rate of the prime. We have seen mortgage rates go back up again, a sure sign of inflation in the housing industry. What I would propose, and I proposed it way back in March when I was a candidate in my own state of Illinois, I proposed $11.3 billion specifically in cuts in the federal budget. I think we've got to have fiscal restraint. And I said at that time that one of the things that we could do that perhaps would save as much as $5 to $7 billion, according to one of the leading members of the House Budget Committee, was to recalculate the index that is used to determine the cost of living benefits that are paid to civil service retirees, to military retirees. That we ought to, in addition to that, we ought to pay those retirement benefits on the basis of once a year rather than twice a year and save $750 billion. In other words,
Anderson,
fiscal restraint,
your time
I think, is necessary.
Ms. Loomis?
Reagan, repeating the question, and I would ask you again to engage in as many specifics as you possibly can. What politically unpopular measures are you willing to endorse, push, and stay with that might provide real progress in reducing inflation?
I believe that the only unpopular measures actually that could be or would be applied would be unpopular with government and with those perhaps some special interest groups who are tied closely to government. I believe that inflation today is caused by government simply spending more than government takes in, at the same time that government has imposed upon business and industry, from the shopkeeper on the corner to the biggest industrial plant in America, countless harassing regulations and punitive taxes that have reduced productivity at the same time they have increased the cost of production. And when you are reducing productivity at the same time that you are turning out printing press money in excessive amounts, you're causing inflation. And it isn't really higher prices, it's just you are reducing the value of the money, you are robbing the American people of their savings. And so the plan that I have proposed, and contrary to what John says, my plan is for a phased-in tax cut over a 3-year period, tax increase in depreciation allowances for business and industry to give them the capital to refurbish plant and equipment, research and development, improved technology, all of which we see our foreign competitors having, and we have the greatest percentage of outmoded industrial plant and equipment of any of the industrial nations. Produce more, have stable money supply, and give the people of this country a greater share of their own savings. Now, I know that this has been called inflationary by my opponent and by the man who isn't here tonight. But I don't see where it is inflationary to have people keep more of their earnings and spend it, and it isn't inflationary for government to take that money away from them and spend it on the things it wants to spend it on. I believe we need incentive for the individual and for business and industry, and I believe the plan that I have submitted with detailed backing and which has been approved by a number of our leading economists in the country is based on projections, conservative projections out for the next 5 years, that indicates that this plan would, by 1983, result in a balanced budget. We have to remember, when we talk a tax cut, we're only talking about reducing a tax increase, because this administration has left us with a built-in tax increase that will amount to $86 billion next year.
Your time is up.
And $500 billion over the next 5.
Mr. Anderson?
Mr. Moore, in addition to saying that this is no time for a tax cut in view of the incipient signs of renewed inflation, in addition to calling for restraint in federal spending, 15 months ago I also suggested we ought to have an emergency excise tax on gasoline. I say that because I think this year we will send $90 billion out of this country to pay for imported oil, even though those imports have been reduced. And since I first made that proposal 15 months ago, the price of gasoline, which was then 80 cents, has gone up to about $1.30. In other words, we've had a huge increase of about 50 cents a gallon since that time, and all of that increase has gone out of this country, or much of it, into the pockets of OPEC oil producers. Whereas I have proposed we ought to put that tax on here at home, reduce our consumption of that imported oil, recycle those proceeds then back into the pockets of the American workers by reducing their tax payments, their Social Security tax payments, by 50%. That, I think, in addition, would be an anti-inflationary measure that would strengthen the economy of this country.
Mr. Reagan.
Well, I cannot see where a 50-cent a gallon tax applied to gasoline would have changed the price of gasoline. It would still have gone up as much as it has, and the 50 cents would be added on top of that. And it would be a tax paid by the consumers, and then we're asked to believe that some way they would get this back to the consumers. Well, why? Why take it in the first place if you're going to give it back? Why not leave it with them? And now John spoke about 15 years ago in the position that or 15 months ago and what he believed in. 15 months ago, he was a co-signer and advocating the very tax cut that I am proposing, and said that that would be a forward step in fighting inflation and that it would be beneficial to the working people of this country.
The next question goes to Mr. Reagan from Daniel Greenberg.
Well, gentlemen, what I'd like to say first is I think the panel and the audience would appreciate responsiveness to the questions rather than repetitions of your campaign addresses. My question for the governor is, every serious examination of the future supply of energy and other essential resources, including air, land, and water, finds that we face shortages and skyrocketing prices, and that in many ways we're pushing the environment to dangerous limits. I'd like to know specifically what changes you would encourage and require in American lifestyles, in automobile use, housing, land use, and general consumption, to meet problems that aren't going to respond to campaign lullabies about minor conservation efforts and more production.